So let's get started. So my topic for today is you say goodbye and I say hello, language as a holistic phenomenon. But before I talk about language, I want to talk about elephants first because I love elephants. And let's pretend we're not linguists and sociologists and media studies people and cognitive scientists, but let's pretend we're people studying animals and animal behavior. And since we can't all travel to Africa or to Asia, we go to the local zoo to study elephants because that's where they are. And we want to find out about the sleep patterns of elephants. And after studying them, looking at them for a couple of weeks, we discovered that elephants on average sleep between 4 and 6 hours a day, during daytime, during nighttime. So that's our finding here. But then our friends from Africa tell us that that's actually not true because elephants in the wild never sleep 4 to 6 hours a day. They sleep roughly about 2 hours and mostly during the night and in much, much shorter intervals. So the findings that we found in the zoo were far off compared to the stuff we see in the wild. How about lions then? Maybe it's just a problem with elephants because they're so big. Maybe other animals show different kinds of behaviors here. What you see here is a lion's skull from recent studies, and actually 2 lion skulls. And on the left-hand side, you see the foramen magnum. That's the one here. That's the canal that connects the brain with the spinal cord, basically. That's where the whole thing goes through. That's what you see over here. And here's another one. And when you look very carefully, you immediately see that, well, that one is smaller, basically, right? There's something intruding into that foramen magnum, and this one is much wider. And that's what scholars discovered, that the left-hand side, the one with the smaller canal, basically, that's a lion in captivity. And that's what many lions in captivity show, which means that they also have serious behavioral problems. They stagger about, basically, and many of them die even because the root canal between the spinal cord and the brain is damaged here because of that smaller foramen magnum. In the wild, on the right-hand side, that never occurs, right? And they discovered that this is probably because of lack of stress in captivity and a better diet. So they basically grow more bones, bone material, and therefore damage their foramen magnum. And again, the same thing. If we just study lions in captivity, we come up with the wrong conclusion that they all have this damage to the foramen magnum. Third and last animal for the day, hyenas. And this is not so much about physiology, but about behavior. If you give hyenas something to play with, puzzles to solve, like getting something out of a box through a tricky mechanism, you immediately see that hyenas in captivity are much, much better at problem solving for whatever reason than hyenas in the wild. So again, just studying them in the zoo gives us a completely wrong picture about what hyenas really can do and what they cannot do. Just like studying lions in the zoo gives us a wrong idea about their skull, and when we look at elephants, we get the wrong idea about their sleep patterns. We'll come back to that later on. We just started with the animals and now we turn to language. But we had a reason for talking about animals first. Starting with a very simple question, what is linguistics? And the obvious answer is linguistics investigates language, right? What else? So the second question is, what is language then? And hundreds of people have looked into that question. And I just want to give you some examples here. Hang on. Yeah. So Aristotle, way back, said that basically language is spoken sounds which are symbols of affections in the soul. And then he talks about written marks being symbols of spoken sounds. Simple as that. There's no context here. He doesn't talk about gestures or intonation. He talks about this whole sound and affections of the soul idea. Very simple. Hang on, I can't. Okay. Okay, Dwight Bollinger, not that early, a lot later actually, says, in most accounts of language, gesture has been underrated or ignored. Body language, along with other bodily functions, has been partially tabooed subject. Even today, one would feel embarrassed at saying to someone, why did you thrust your head forward when you said that? though a question such as, why did you say absolutely when you weren't sure, is commonplace. As a reflection of this, but also because of their own traditions, linguists have concentrated on the language of information, propositional language, which is the only kind that writing can convey with a high degree of efficiency. But even this kind of language, when spoken, is signaled as true or false, positive or doubtful, welcome, unwelcome by gesture. And all other forms of language, questions, commands, wishes, exclamations, denials, are heavily dependent on it. I found that a very, very interesting quote. It's from 1968 from Bollinger, who obviously stresses the importance of what other people have called extra-linguistic information, so gesture, facial expressions, and so on and so forth. Karl Bühler, German psychologist, as you all know, was a lot stricter than that. He says, well, one of the central elements of language are words and sentences, and the claim of facial expressions and gestures to be a natural language prior to and outside of human oral language fails to pass precisely this last test, namely of having words and sentences. And therefore, he says, more carefully and correctly, the claim that gestures have linguistic character is only justified when the natural eloquence of the human body has been elaborated and transferred to a system on the pattern of natural language, as in the sign language of deaf mutes, of Cistercian monks, and so on and so forth. So he really talks about sign languages in the sense of ASL or BSL, for instance, and the Cistercian code of communicating, basically. But for him, all the other gestures are not linguistic at all, because they fail to show words and sentences in the systematic sense. Eugenio Cruzerio, a German scholar who looked into Romance languages, says the language external actions accompany and complement speech. Okay, so he can acknowledge there is something. Sometimes they can even substitute it. And of course, there's also competence, which corresponds to the non-linguistic means of expression, since you know how to use gesture generally and how to use them in a particular community. And then he talks about deictic expressions. He talks about the inhabitants of Naples having a very, very complex way of gesturing and so on and so forth. But he concludes, here, we don't want to pursue extra-linguistic means of expressions and the competence and so on and so forth. So he acknowledges the fact that there is something outside language which is important and interesting to look at, and then says, nah, let's not look at that. We don't have time for that. One of the most surprising findings for me was this from Hjelmslev in 1963. And he says the long supremacy of conventional phonetics has had the effect of restricting the linguist's conception even of natural language in a way that is demonstrably unempirical, that is inappropriate because non-exhaustive. That was a surprise. So the long supremacy of conventional phonetics had the effect of restricting the conception of natural language in a way that is demonstrably unempirical, inappropriate, non-exhaustive. It's been supposed that the expression substance of a spoken language must consist exclusively of sounds. Thus, as has been pointed out by the Zwirners in particular, the fact has been overlooked that speech is accompanied by and that components of speech can be replaced by gesture, and that in reality, as the Zwirners say, not only the so-called organs of speech, but very nearly all the striate musculature cooperate in the exercise of natural language. So here, really, in the 1960s, we find one of the first expressive claims that language is more than just sound, and that restricting ourselves to sound and to the graphemes that maybe correspond to sound, as Aristotle says, is unempirical and inappropriate and non-exhaustive, and a big, big problem. Unfortunately, like all the other people before him, Hjelmslev then does not study language in this contextualized way, but at least he puts up the claim of saying there's something out there that needs to be studied, which we have overlooked because of the long supremacy, the long tradition that we have. This is my last quote from Bloomfield. Of course, no talk should go without Bloomfield. And he says, the stimulus which calls forth speech leads also to some other reaction. Still other responses are visible, but not directly important. They do not change the layout of things, but they do, along with speech, serve as stimuli to the hearer. These actions are facial expressions, mimicry, tone of voice, and so on, the insignificant handling of objects, and so on and so forth. So he says, yes, there is something, but we need not really concern ourselves with that, because we as linguists focus on language, and you can study all the other stimuli basically as also calling for reactions, but we're not looking into that. And interestingly, at the end of that quote, he says that, well, gestures accompanies all speech, and sometimes he claims that speech kind of overtakes the gesture bit. So even such obvious transference as pointing backward to indicate past time is probably due to a linguistic habit of using the same word for in the rear or in the past. So he says the linguistic clue was first the grammaticalization of back as past, which then was followed by the gesture. And as many of you will know, this is really turning things on their head, because most studies today would always say, well, gesture comes first and language comes later. I found that very surprising. To cut a long story short, when we look at the history of linguistics and the many eminent scholars that we have there, some of them completely ignore or negate the importance of gesture and outside linguistic material as something beside language, but not really part of language. Sometimes they acknowledge them as supporting language, maybe. Others, like Hyenas, for instance, explicitly said we need to study gesture, mimicry, facial expressions, intonation, and so on and so forth, but did not offer any approaches, any methods that we can use there, but the claims have been out there. And what this leads to, of course, is the modern picture of mainstream linguistics, which pretty much looks like that. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about these diagrams. That's not my point. All I want to say is that mainstream generative linguistics, for instance, is mainly concerned with these things. So on the right-hand side here, you see a very, very simple outline of the linguistic system. So you have a lexicon and you have some computational mechanisms. You have morphology and phonology, a logical form, a computational component, but you will not find any contextual information here. You will not find gesture, you will not find facial expressions. You probably wouldn't even find intonation to a large degree unless it is somewhere here as an important part of the linguistic system as such. And then, of course, you can draw these nice trees, basically in minimalism, where you explain how sentences are composed. But again, no gesture, no extra linguistic, what we call extra linguistic information here. To be very clear, I'm not saying this is wrong, right? This is not a full frontal attack on minimalism and theoretical linguistics. I'm not saying this is wrong. All I'm saying, together with Hyenas, is that there might be more out there when we look. And this is what this talk will be about. And one way of looking at things, of doing things differently, is construction grammar. And that's my approach that I want to show you today, that I want to use in my discussion. Construction grammar, in a nutshell, goes to the 1970s or so, the Berkeley School with Paul Kay and Chuck Fillmore. And the idea of construction grammar rests on the Saussurean sign. So the Saussurean sign, Ferdinand de Saussure, 1916, the Cours de Linguistique Générale, where you have words, and these words consist of a signifier, a form, or a sound, basically like apple, and this is conventionally and arbitrarily associated with the signified, the meaning or the concept of an apple in our head. That's the very traditional Saussurean notion of a linguistic sign. And what construction grammar does is it takes this very simple and basic notion and extends it beyond the word. It extends that to morphemes, to syntax, to syntactic patterns, argument structures, everything you find in language. The claim is that the whole linguistic system does not look like this with words and rules. So the rules put the words together that we have in our lexicon, but the linguistic system consists of these conventionalized form meaning pairings, not just on the level of words, but also on the level of syntax. What does that look like? Well, this is one way of writing down constructions. There are many others as well, but this is one where the big box around that, you see, we don't do trees anymore. We now do boxes, and you have a big box around here. And inside that box, you have a form side where you can note down syntactic properties, morphological properties, phonological properties of the thing you look at. You have a symbolic link, which is missing here, I'm sorry, between the two. And the meaning side where you have semantic properties, pragmatic properties, discourse functional properties, whatever you need. And one of the important points in construction grammar is that we are pretty much free to write down what we find important for a construction. So we have syntactic, morphological, and phonological properties. We can leave one of them out, for instance, if we don't find them important, but we can also add more. And so, for instance, one thing I will suggest later on in this talk, that we could actually write down gestures here in the form component of a construction. So this is what a construction schematically looks like. How does that look like in practice? Well, it all started basically with idioms. So if you have idioms like take the mickey out of someone, spill the beans, bark up the wrong tree, pay through your teeth, and so on and so forth. Obviously, these are more complex than words. They are more or less schematic. So for instance, with spill the beans, you have various subjects. You can have spill in the present or in the past, for instance. So they are slightly variable, which makes them more or less schematic, but they are mostly non-compositional in the sense that if you don't know what they mean, you can't guess, right? So you have to learn their meaning by heart. There's no way of deriving at that meaning by looking at the individual words. So spilling the beans obviously has nothing to do with spilling and with beans, but about divulging secrets. And one idea of construction grammar in the early days was to take these idioms, write them down in the form side of the construction, and link them in a conventional way to the meaning side. So for instance, on the form side, you would spell out spill the beans, and in the meaning side, you spell out divulge a secret. Easy as that. So it started with these idioms. Then things developed, and over time we also looked at these funny argument structure constructions. So you find in numerous corpora, you find examples like, could he shriek himself unconscious? Firefighters cut the man free, and he had often drunken himself silly, which look somehow odd to the regular native speaker, because shrieking, for instance, is intransitive, right? You can shriek, but you can't shriek somebody, for instance. And firefighters cut the man. Well, they didn't cut the man. They didn't hurt him. They cut the man free. There's something odd here. And you can drink wine, you can drink beer, but you cannot drink yourself, and you cannot drink yourself silly. And yet they occur in natural speech. How can we explain that? Construction grammar would suggest that all these are examples of the so-called resultative construction. The resultative construction is down here. That's the form side. Very, very simple and schematic. So the subject, the verb, the object, and an adjective phrase. And this is the meaning side. X causes Y to be Z by verbing. So the firefighter is the subject. X caused the man, that's Y, to be free by verbing, by cutting, right? So this action leads to a certain result, being unconscious, being free, being silly, for instance. And the idea for construction grammar is that this is the underlying construction in your mind that allows you to build these concrete examples of that. So you can fill these slots as you like. And later on, maybe tonight when you go to the pub, you can try that out and try new resultative constructions, basically. So you can learn these things quite easily once you see the pattern underneath. But the idea, let me remind you, is still the same, that conventionalized form meaning pairings like the Saussurean word. That's my last technical bit. We can show that basically the whole linguistic system as we know it, the traditional linguistic system here in the middle, can be translated into constructions and construction type by dividing them into atomic, so simple and complex constructions, substantive, concrete, and schematic or abstract constructions. So the word or the lexicon, this is atomic and simple, but also concrete, right? Green and anaconda, for instance. Complex and substantive would be an idiom, like that's the way the cookie crumbles. And then you can go up that scale and you see that, for instance, you have complex and completely schematic subject, a tensed verb, and two objects. That's the ditransitive or the passive down here. So what I'm saying is that in the framework of construction grammar, the whole linguistic system can now be spelled out in these forms. Interestingly, and this is where cognitive linguistics and cognitive science comes in, the idea is now that knowledge of language is knowledge of constructions. And Joan Bybee says grammar is the cognitive organization of one's experience with language. Adele Goldberg says it's constructions all the way down, it's everywhere. And Martin Hilpert says knowledge of language consists of a large network of constructions and nothing else in addition. Constructions are, at least this model of construction grammar is a usage-based model, which means that they are not innate as in traditional generative frameworks, but constructions are learned. And they are learned from the input that children and also adults receive from the people around them, from the context, by drawing on general cognitive mechanisms such as abstraction, schematization, categorization, and so on. So basic general learning principles, the same way you learn how to cook spaghetti, how to play tennis, or play the piano. Same idea. So you have various instances, A, B, C, D, E, and you filter out of these instances an abstraction. So if you hear teddy, teddy bear, cookie, milk, mom, and so on, after a while, you realize they have something in common, and you develop this schema of a noun construction over time. The instances, of course, are specified maybe in greater detail, and the abstraction is specified in lesser detail in this case. But the important thing is that you learn construction from the input around you. Langeke says that the unit, the construction, emerges by reinforcing and progressive entrenchment of a commonality apparent at some level of abstraction that recurs in a sufficient number of events. So frequency plays a role, of course. The more often you see something, the more deeply it is entrenched. But we also know, for instance, now that very salient patterns, not even patterns, very salient instances can also stick with speakers, and they don't have to be highly frequent. Just again, think about idioms like what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. How often have you heard that in your lifetime? Like 3 or 4 maybe, and if you search them in corpora, they are extremely rare, and still people remember them. So highly salient is another factor. But the most important thing comes again from Bybee, and this is the quote down here. That's really important now. Exemplar representations are rich memory representations. They contain, at least potentially, all the information a language user can perceive in a linguistic experience. All the information a language user can perceive. This information consists of phonetic detail, including redundant and variable features, lexical items and constructions used, meaning, inferences made from this meaning and from the context, and properties of the social, the physical, and the linguistic context. There you have it. The input that goes into the formation of constructions, Bybee claims, is extremely rich, and it includes voice quality, it includes room temperature, it includes gesture, facial expression, clothing, everything you find there. And the great task, of course, for the language user, upon hearing this rich informative context, is to filter out what's important and what's not, right? So that, for instance, a hoarse voice maybe is not part of the message, or maybe it is. That some intonation conveys sarcasm, other intonation doesn't, right? So that's the job of the language user now, to take this rich informative context and to distill out of that this stuff that is helpful and important and that sticks, and to ignore the rest maybe. A couple of years ago, I did some research with Elizabeth Zima from Freiburg, and we looked into this question of language and multimodality from a constructional perspective. So we'll use these key ideas of construction grammar to look into language and gesture and their relationship. And one model, of course, that's always been around is that language use is multimodal. So you have multimodal communication and a multimodal system of knowledge of symbols. This is maybe what you find in McNeil, maybe also in Camden in famous gesture studies, where it's not quite clear how language and gesture relate to each other because it all seems to be this multimodal communication pattern. We suggested that from a construction grammar point of view, you can focus that question a little bit better. You can say, well, there's multimodal communication, of course, and there's the constructicon. The constructicon is the mental lexicon, the mind where you store the constructions, right? So the constructions are stored in your constructicon, in your mental lexicon. And there's multimodal communication. This is what we observe. And now the question is this constructicon, where we store the constructions, are the constructions themselves just verbal, or are they multimodal? So should we include the multimodal information into the constructional information or not? We discovered that almost all research in construction grammar is purely verbal. And in some cases, well, construction grammarians haven't really said a lot yet about their theoretical convictions. So if they think that constructions should be multimodal or not. Usually when you talk about this topic, these are the principled reservations that you get. So some people say, yeah, okay, maybe it's conceivable that there are some constructions that are probably multimodal. I'm a linguist and I study language. But my answer to that, of course, would be, well, is it clever to have an a priori limitation on language use and data if you are a usage-based linguist? I don't think so. Second objection that you often hear is, yes, communication is multimodal, but let's keep the term language for the verbal system. Good point. That's what Bollinger and all the others said, that there's the verbal system and there's extra stuff. And yet, a number of studies have shown now that meaning, for instance, or meaning construction is the integration of all sorts of information. So when you study speakers and how they construct meaning in a given context, they draw information from all sorts of channels. And these channels can't always be easily separated. That's another problem that you're facing if you want to just focus on the verbal channel, for instance. And of course, thought itself is multimodal. So keeping the term language just for the verbal system has its problems, I think. Third point, yes, it's conceivable that we have multimodal constructions, but construction grammar is so young and not mainstream in linguistics yet. So let's concentrate on the verbal parts first. That looks plausible at first. However, if it turns out that constructions and language is multimodal in the end, then we've built our whole nice theoretical model, and then we have to tear it down again and rebuild it with the multimodal perspective. So I don't think that's a very clever way to start. And last but not least, people say, well, the constructicon constructions can't be multimodal because we can use language monomodally in just one mode, just spoken, for instance. Well, that's plain not true. These are the two models that are usually discovered here. So the gray box is what you find in the traditional system, right? So that's what many people do. So you have as a default, as the standard, you have monomodal writing and the verbal language system, which then experiences an ad hoc enrichment, which leads to the multimodal face-to-face language use. And Alan Schenke and Per Linnell and others have called this the written language bias, that simply for theoretical reasons, linguists for decades, if not centuries, have looked at spoken and just spoken and written language because they did not really have access and methods to look beyond that. And so they assumed that the verbal language system, or monomodal writing, the written down verbal part, is the real language, and all the rest is just performance on top. I would like to claim, together with Elizabeth, that it's the other way around. We would like to show that actually we have multimodal face-to-face language use, and the monomodal writing and the verbal speech system are an abstraction of the linguists in the end. So we'd like to turn that upside down. Okay. That's my theory so far, and now let me show you what I mean with that. And this is the point where I hope that technology serves me well. Can you give me a sign if you can hear that?
Well, goodbye. 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 Enjoy yourself. Bye. Goodbye. 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 Bye. Well, goodbye. 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 Goodbye.
This really reminds me of like 90% of all the Zoom meetings that I have. This is really what they end like. Everybody is very excited and everybody starts waving and shouting and goodbying and whatnot. This is what many of us maybe have experienced. And people have begun to study that. So why do we feel compelled to wave at the end of Zoom calls? Because I agree. I mean, I've never waved goodbye when I leave the room. That sounds strange to me. And here's a quote from a newspaper article. "I'm an absolute waver," said Mindy Skura, a licensed social worker and school adjustment counselor in Maynard, Massachusetts public schools. "It replaces the handshake. When you're in front of a screen, it's more forced and stilted, and I think we're trying to compensate, so we almost go overboard with the nonverbal gestures." Maybe. Laura Dudley says, "This personal touch is missing. We're hungering for that human interaction, that friendliness, so we're starting to do things like waving to say goodbye. It feels a little nicer than just clicking off." Maybe. Gretchen McCulloch says, "Waving is also a way to make the end of meetings less awkward and sudden. With video calls, once you're gone, you're gone. It's abrupt. When you see everyone waving, you know that everyone is prepared for this call to end, and you're not going to be suddenly hanging up on somebody." Larry Rosen, "That feeling of completion is an important part of communication. The hand wave just says we're done. Our instinct is we need to close and complete that loop. In person, we can't close it with our words. But that doesn't work in large meetings on Zoom." Melanie Brewster, last quote, "People are overperforming social clues of closure because crossing out a window on your computer is so much more ambiguous than standing up, walking out of a room, or doing other signaling for in-person terminations of meetings." I find that weird. How can like closing the window be ambiguous? But that's another question. So people have looked into this behavior of why do we all of a sudden start waving in conference calls. We haven't waved before when we ended our faculty meetings at university, for instance. So what's going on here? I think all these people, maybe they're right, maybe they have a point, but I think there's another explanation. And of course, there's this technical explanation. If you have 40 people there and 40 people say bye, you get lost. So there's a purely technical aspect to it too. But beyond the technology, I think there's also a very interesting thing to be learned. And this has to do with 4E cognition. 4E cognition is the idea that our cognitive system is embodied, embedded, extended, inactive. Embodied in the sense that we experience our knowledge with our bodies. Our consciousness is embedded in a context. It's extended, so we can extend that to things beyond our body, our own cognition, and it's inactive, so we reproduce in our action cognitive mechanism. This is obviously contra-Cartesian, both with regard to language and cognition. So here, cognition is no longer seen in abstraction and isolation, but it's really, was it Lakoff who said, it's cognition in the flesh. And it's also pro-usage-based developmental dynamic approaches that operate with rich informational context and input. So our cognition, our knowledge is built with our bodies. And Johnson says, no traditional understanding of science as having meaning, constructions, only through some conceptual or propositional content grounded in reference to states of affairs in the world could even begin to capture the richness of body-based meaning that is experienced in all of these varied forms of human meaning-making and communicative activity. So he clearly claims for a more body-based study of science, right? So where do the science come from? And pretty sure you all have heard about the metaphor studies, the embodied metaphors. Up is good, down is bad, and so on, and warmth is good, and so on and so forth. We know a lot about that already, but I would like to use the same idea here for constructions and bye-bye. There are some recent studies on speech, gesture, and 4E cognition, which I find very interesting. So Gentilucci and Della Volta and Hugh et al., they show very convincingly that the spoken language and arm gestures, for instance, are controlled neurologically by the same motor control system in Broca's area. So Broca's area is not, as we traditionally think, for language. It's also active for arm gestures. And in a similar vein, Hostetter and Alibali, Mastal and Buryanova were able to show something that they call visible embodiment and gestures as simulated action, that the working memory and cognitive load are affected by speech and gesture because they are processed in the same domain, basically. The inhibition they show of gestures requires extensive cognitive motor control, right? So it's exhausting not to gesture. And it thus increases cognitive load, the inhibition. Gesturing, on the other hand, frees up cognitive load in those studies. So if you tell people to memorize some letters, a sequence of letters while doing maths, and you tell them, well, you can gesture as much as you like, they are performing a lot better than the people who are not allowed to gesture while doing maths and memorizing those letter forms. I think that waving goodbye is acquired pretty early, at about 10 months of age, and it's deeply entrenched in infant cognition, and I can show that.
Sydney, can you say bye-bye? Yay! Good girl!
She can't believe herself that the hand is moving these things.
Where's my pretty girl? Can you say bye-bye? Can you wave bye-bye? Say bye-bye. Yeah, can you clap your hands?
She can, but she finds it a lot harder to clap her hands. But you can also see how much focus it takes for her to make that movement. And interestingly, the caregiver said, can you say bye-bye? They didn't say, can you wave bye-bye? Can you say bye-bye? And you get the gesture for that. So this is something that we learn very, very early, and that is extremely deeply entrenched, I think, in our cognition, right? It's something that we really are used to do.
Where's my pretty?
And so I would like to claim that we have something like the bye-bye construction. The form is bye-bye, the phonological form. That's simple, and there's probably a raised hand, palm outward. There can be waving, there doesn't have to be waving. So in most meetings, for instance, I just raise my hand in recognition, basically. But that doesn't matter so much. The meaning is farewell and the end of the meeting. And I think that the increased cognitive capacities, the greater cognitive control, and the sociocultural norms and conventions, they can now make the gesture part of those constructions optional. So in the sense that as babies and young learners, we learn bye-bye and the gesture to go with that, right? That's an automatic reaction that we have. And then over time, we learn that we don't do that, right? In school, we don't wave at our high school teacher. That's awkward, for instance. And we don't wave at faculty meetings. So socio-cultural norms maybe speak against that. And the greater cognitive control that we have, of course, means that we don't have to wave, right, to free up cognitive load. And maybe, just maybe, in video conferences, we usually experience a great cognitive load as we are processing the various forms of input. So many people have reported that they find video conferencing hard, exhausting, that they need to concentrate so much. So all this is stressful. And maybe the waving can reduce this cognitive load and the level of stress, right? So instead of just having verbal clues, we externalize, we go back to our baby days and basically wave, because that frees up cognitive processing at that point. What this means is, and that's almost my last slide, that I would like to make a plea for a holistic approach to language. Holism is a term that goes way, way back, but one of the earliest studies is by Smoot in 1926, Holism and Evolution. And it's the idea that systems must also be viewed as wholes and not just as the sums of individual parts. Traditionally, that's what you see on the right-hand side here. Language is basically the sum of its parts. So you take the individual sounds, you put them together, you get words. You put the words together, you get sentences, and everything is like, it's like Lego blocks, basically, like built on top of each other. But nobody really looked at the whole system. And I think this is something we might want to do. So I'm thinking about Peter Urich's lovely example of Ellen DeGeneres saying, I'm not married, I'm married, for instance. That's a nice example that maybe he can comment on later on. I just learned yesterday about Alan Shanky's extremely fascinating idea of polysemiotic communicative systems. Maybe we want to think about language as one of these polysemiotic communicative systems. And looking at language holistically would mean that phonemes and morphemes and syntax and intonation and gesture do not equal language, because the whole, taking all of that together, is more than just adding and adding and adding, right? We can still analyze linguistic verbal systems independently of gesture, of intonation, facial expressions, and so on. We can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Let me say that very, very clearly, right? And this can give us very valuable clues on how language, narrowly construed, is part of a polysemiotic communicative system. But we need to be aware, I think, that this is language in the zoo, just like the lions and the elephants. To fully understand natural language, broadly construed, I think we must study it as it really is, or language in the wild. Thank you.